Hey, thanks so much, David. Can you all hear me okay? Cool, great. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about my experience around doing product research and why I think product research does in fact rule. And collaborated with a couple of colleagues on this. But I'll first try to answer. People say, well, wait, what do you mean by product research? I've heard of user research, I've heard of market research. What do you mean by product research? So yeah, we know what user research is. It's sort of identifying what people do, very qualitative in nature usually, and the outcome is some kind of shared or better understanding of whatever target user you're looking to understand more about. And then you've got something like market research, and you're trying to understand what's going on with the markets on a broader scale. It's much more quantitative in nature. And the outcome is like some good way to frame the market in a way that you might be able to go serve that market. And the last thing I'll add isn't necessarily in the name, but it's things around product analytics. So we all have products in market. Most of them are digital. They can tell us a lot about usage of a product. How does a customer use our product? Where do they navigate from screen to screen, stage to stage, flow to flow, etc. It's also very quantitative in nature. And the outcome of that can tell us things about trends and patterns in those customer behaviors or user behaviors. And so really product research is the mix of all three. It's not one or the other. It really needs to be all three. We need to understand what the users are doing, maybe outside of the product itself. So that's where the limits of the product analytics will happen. We need to frame all this information in the context of a broader market. One of my earlier failures as a product person was that I did a bunch of product research, mostly user research and some analytics, but I failed to frame it in terms of the market. And we ended up having this product that really didn't go anywhere because we didn't understand the broader market that it could have been serving. So yeah, and we can go certain layers and granular deeper in terms of generative, descriptive, but you can start to see when you break down into the subcategories of these different types, there are some overlaps here in terms of what they can and can't do. I won't go into them in detail here, but as a product person, we need to understand all of these, right? It's not like we need to be focused on one or the other. It's not an and or kind of conversations. It's a both. Either or. It's a both and kind of conversation. So we need to pull all of these together because they're all different pieces of data that we need to drive better decisions. And part of it is because we've been around, we've seen this a lot. Products fail, and there's plenty of studies that show this. Here's basically a handful of reasons why from a couple of different studies or publications. And I kind of put this as it really comes down to they didn't do their product research right. They didn't do their homework. And yes, we want to move fast and break things to a degree, but then you end up with broken things. So let's be a little smarter in how we do this. And I think this goes back to that key question that probably keeps at least me up, if not most product people up at night, is are we building the right thing? Are we building the right thing that's going to deliver value to our customers and value to the business at the same time? It's not a either or situation. It's a both and those two things have to be connected. So I'll tell you a few stories along the way that kind of support these different rules that my colleagues and I have kind of tried to distill this into. And one is a story you may have heard about. This guy's Bill is a successful entrepreneur, worked with Steve Jobs, a lot of years in Silicon Valley, had a $80 million exit for a startup he founded. And you think, great, must know what he's doing. And so he even had this, I don't need to learn from other people's stuff. So he created this app. This is many years ago. He was trying to build an app on top of Facebook at the time. I think it was like 2011-ish, so maybe about 10 years ago. Trying to do something new around taking photos and sharing photos. This is before Instagram got quite popular. And on release, within about 30 minutes, these are some of the reviews, right? There's zero chance I'm going to return to this app. Our friends aren't in it. It's confusing. This is not very fun. And you think is it that bad? Like you clearly didn't do enough of your homework at all to have this kind of reaction when you first launch a product, especially one that I think had $41 million of investment in. And so Bill realized oh man, we messed up. So within a half an hour of launching, right? So this is a very expensive mistake, right? A $41 million investment mistake. So they had color.com, you can look up the story. They got $41 million of investment in VC, partly because you invest in the people, right? You get a good team. It isn't necessarily always about the idea, But here's an example, and there are many more, right? We know that there's plenty of these. And I asked the question, well, why? And how do we avoid this? Can we not build the wrong thing? Can we build the wrong thing less? But we know that there's product graveyard, which actually today is a product graveyard. If you go there, it doesn't exist anymore. There's like, I think Google, there's somebody put like a Google failery or the failery blog. There's a lot of obsession with failure. And it's not that failure is a bad thing or that we shouldn't try to build products that don't work, but at the same rate, we should build them in terms of hypotheses, right? And I think there's definitely a prevailing notion about that. But when you see millions and millions and millions of dollars poured into this, you're thinking, okay, the pendulum has swung too far in that direction. Let's not do that. And this study blew me away. This is by the Standish Group. They studied about 2,000 projects over about 1,000 companies. So 2,000 software projects over about 1,000 companies. And they realized that about half of what was shipped was never used, which I almost fell over because yes, I knew that there was, yes, we ship some stuff that isn't used. Yes, that's experimental. Yes, we're learning. Great. But when you start to combine that with what's rarely used, you're getting well over half of your stuff that you've shipped never used. I mean, that's a lot of resource waste. And isn't lean startup supposed to help with that? Like lean manufacturing was all about reducing waste, and so was lean startup. Reduce the muda, get rid of waste. But and okay, great. But we think lean startup is build, measure, learn, right? And that was sort of the mantra that Eric Ries and team put forward. Sounds great on paper, but what oftentimes happens in reality is that we just keep building stuff. Well, we build it, we ship it, we build it, we ship it, build it, ship it. And there's less learning and less iteration, less ideation. Like there's sometimes we're just kind of building stuff because we get so hung on to like, oh, we have to build this. We just have to build this. Okay, in service of what? So this gets to that first rule of product research is really is prepare to be wrong because you're going to be. And when you have that mindset, and I'm sure you probably heard that beginner's mindset in the past, is it's okay to be wrong and be wrong early because it's better to be wrong at an early ideation stage and prove yourself wrong, then you're more likely to be right. I think it was Edison said, I've not failed 10,000 times, I just figured out 10,000 ways not to do it. However, circling back to Bill, he's like, yeah, I was totally wrong. And I don't have a problem with being wrong, right? So it's good that he has that learning mindset, but maybe we didn't have to use $41 million of somebody else's money, right? But there's lots of other stories out there. I mean, you've probably heard of Kiwi, which is like I forget how many, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even $1 billion in funding. They had a ton of money. Kiwi went nowhere. The Juicero, which was also a bit of a one that had I think over 100 million in funding total, that also went nowhere. So there's lots of these out there, and the driver behind kind of writing this book and thinking about these things is because one, I've done it on a much smaller scale, but two, like, how do we prevent this? How do we not do this in the future? So I think one of the first parts is be okay with being wrong and try to prove yourself wrong way up ahead of the game. All right, so moving on to the next thing is like, how do we not stay biased, right? Everyone doesn't think they're biased, but we usually are. So my product coach, Hope Gurion, she used to work at a company called Beachbody years ago. And they had 250,000 users. And the challenge was that when she first got in, there were the management was just looking at these expert users. Like, oh yeah, we just need to look at the expert users. And she's like, but what happened to the 247,500 other users? Like, you're ignoring them. And this team was so biased in going after these expert users that they ended up building this product that worked well for the literally like 1% of the user base, but it didn't work well for the other 99. So they were missing a huge part of the market. So what Hope did was basically said, look, I'm going to go do some research. So she packed up the product team. They went out and got in touch with these other, maybe not all of them, but a good chunk of them. The product wasn't instrumented at the time. This was years ago before they had a good analytics packages. But she got some data, did a bunch of conversations, and did some product research to learn what the right thing was. And when they overhauled the app and made a new version, they got a standing ovation when they showed the next version of it, because the rest of the users were like, "Oh my God, you're finally solving my problems that this other app wasn't, other version wasn't solving." So, the rule number 2 is you're going to be biased. Like, you are going to be biased. We are bad at seeing bias in ourselves, but we're actually pretty good about seeing bias in other people. So the example with Hope is she came into a situation where they were all biased and couldn't see it, but she came in as the outsider and said, "Oh, hey, I think you're missing something here," and that's the kind of thing that can help you. So sometimes getting that third party view or somebody else, hey, I need a fresh set of eyes on this, right? That's where that can come from. So number 3, we think we have the answers, but sometimes it was the question that was wrong. And if you're a product person, you all know that questions are really, really important. So my friend Daniel, he no longer works at Ericsson. He used to lead their IoT team, but I think he's left them recently. But he initially was trying to do some product research at Ericsson. And he first had a sort of aside was that he first had an issue with that. The word research meant something different. So if Ericsson deals with 4G and 5G, research for them is like 6G, 7G, and 8G, right? They're this very technology heavy company. So he had to fight that a little bit. But also as he was starting to do his own research, his team had a bunch of questions to answer, but they ultimately had one key question that was kind of driving. It was like the North Star question of, I think it was around manufacturers and how are manufacturers adapting to new technology to come into the new age. So a lot of manufacturers, they just don't have the machinery digitized to the point where we're so used to having everything digitized in the software world with our phones and our laptops, everything has a digital footprint to it. But if you go in factories, even some modern factories today, they have equipment that's 10, 20, 30 years old that doesn't have the connectivity. And so his broader North Star question was around how are companies employing this and struggling with it, because his team wanted to create solutions that could help empower and bring these manufacturers into the new age. And so it is sort of without that key North Star question, sure, he could have gone off in a lot of different directions and answering the smaller questions, but having that North Star question is really key to know where you're going. Just like we all want that North Star vision. If you've read John Cutler's from Amplitude, their sort of North Star vision framework about a North Star vision for your product. It's the same thing with research. We want to make sure we've got that key research question that we want to answer. And that can obviously open up lots of other smaller questions, but it gives you that direction like, oh, if we answer this question, it isn't the question you go ask your customer, but it's a question that drives you on what you're trying to answer. So to get to those insights, right? Because we all want to understand those insights. That's what research offers us, these insights to make better products. We have to start with a really key research question, right? And this is overly simplified, but it's the classic stop and say, well, who, what, and where, and when, and why. And sometimes even just stopping and going through that exercise can be incredibly empowering for you and your teams. So, as product people, we're always talking to customers, right? We always think about talking to customers. But sometimes it actually shouldn't be talking, it should be listening to customers, right? Because we want to understand them, we want to hear them. It's a great story. If you haven't read April Dunford's book, obviously awesome. It is about product marketing and positioning, but it is fantastic. And she tells a story about her when she was early in her career, and this is, I think, quite a number of years ago, but the overall principle applies, is that they had this product in market. And it was like a database product back in, I think in the mid 90s, sort of just around the dot-com was starting to blow up. And it wasn't selling much at all. And they were like, it's just not really selling that well. And they had 200 customers and they were expecting thousands. So I think the management and her boss were like, well, we're gonna sunset this product. But hey, April, before we actually do this, I'd like you to speak with at least half of the users. So there's 200 customers, she has to speak to 100. So okay, so she embarks on this journey to speak to all the customers, and the first 1 to 20 were pretty much the same conversation. She'd be like, oh, I bought what? What did I buy? Oh, I think I tried it once or twice and we don't really use it. And then she had customer number 21. And when she got to customer 21, it was a very different story. And that the guy's like, this thing saves my life. This is a game changer. I can't believe how much better this has made my life. And she's like, tell me more, right? She didn't have the heart to tell the guy that they were actually killing off the product. She just was like, whoa, okay, interesting. Why are you using it? So she started going to classic product discovery mode. Like, what are you using it for? When are you using it? Who's using it? And so she learned all about this. And then she has a whole bunch of other conversations that are about the same. And she's like, yeah, I had another 30 conversations that were the same as the first 20. By the end of actually speaking with all 100 or like half the customers, she goes to her boss and says, well, what do they think? What's going to happen? And she's like, well, there's good news, bad news. Like, the good news is, 95% of the people are just not going to care. But the bad news is 5% of the people are going to be pissed. And what that did is that highlighted, sort of a bit of a user research, but then they had to draw back and frame this. Okay, well, we've solved the really key problem for these 5 people. What's the commonality here? And it turns out it was with a team that had, this was before the days of everything connected and CRMs updating in real time, but teams that had field-based players, meaning like a sales team that might have a headquarters and then a field sales, or a support team that had a headquarters and then a field support, right? It would allow the field team members to upload their data to the centralized database overnight that would then sync all the information. It seems obvious now, right? But this was mid to late 90s when that wasn't really a thing. And so what this highlighted, she had to then frame this use case in a broader market. What's the market here? Right? How do we think about positioning this product in a better market? And she went on, the company went on to sell for $1 billion or so, because they figured out they hit on that user need, they figured out what the market was, and they did some more analytics on it, and they crushed it. So the thing is that interviews are really important as a product person, right? You can't get away with not having direct conversations with your end users. It's so important. And the closer you get the entire development team to those interviews, the faster you'll be able to iterate and learn. Here's a good example, like a little oversimplification, but when you think about interviewing or think about interview styles and conversation styles, think about like a coffee cup, right? You could say, hey, you have a coffee cup. We sell cold brew. Would you like to buy some, right? That's very transactional. You could then tweak that a little bit and say, well, wouldn't it be cool if you had some handmade cold brew? Like, and that's, you're trying to, again, still trying to sell something, maybe a bit confirmational, because you're trying to entice somebody into something and a solution that already exists. But if you were like a little bit more diagnostic, say, hey, tell me about that coffee cup. What's in it? And how often do you drink that? Very different kind of approach, right? Very diagnostic. And a colleague of mine at Mass Challenge, which is a accelerator here in the Boston area, actually they've expanded beyond the Boston area, but he told me about this framework that they looked at all the different companies that went through there. They bucketed them into these, and then they looked at what their success was over time. And while these aren't exact numbers, he basically drew these on a whiteboard and was like, look, the diagnostic teams, they just skyrocketed. It's like clearly they were doing something like that. Diagnostic approach was very helpful to them skyrocketing, whereas the confirmation ones did a little bit better. Transactional ones pretty much died out almost immediately. So take that diagnostic approach, right? It's really, really important. And that sort of diagnostic conversation style, right? Very scientific like thinking. But sometimes just the conversation isn't enough, right? Sometimes we need more than just conversation. When I was at Machine Metrics, I was leading a product team there. Manufacturer, a little bit like Daniel Elizade's story. It was like, while we were able to see the analytics and see what they were doing, it was hard to see what they were doing outside of that, right? Because as you see here is a photograph from one of their clients. They may not be in front of a screen the whole time. And how do we track what they're doing outside of the screen? Where does this workflow fit? Where does our product fit within their day? And so we actually had to go out and talk to them and work with them. I actually sent my senior designer at the time to shadow an operator, and he just spent the entire day with them. And had he not done that, we got so many insights from that, a couple of days in the field shadowing them. We learned that at the time, the interface for the operators was either all red, all green, or all orange, depending on the state of the machine. And we learned that basically when the screen goes red and they get too far behind, they feel so defeated they give up. And when they're more motivated to keep it in the green than they are to get it out of red. And that was an interesting insight we learned. We would have never learned that by asking them or having conversations with them. We would only learn that by actually going to work with them. So that kind of insight didn't come from a conversation. It came from a more working with them over a long period of time, a full day or two, to pull that out. So sometimes that conversation just is not enough. You got to go further. There's lots of things to do that, like have people take out their wallet and explain it to you. Like, there's all sorts of fun things you can do to go beyond just that conversation. And then it's sometimes hard in the pandemic space to get beyond a Zoom screen sometimes. And when I was at Machine Metrics, we actually started to use a lot of FaceTiming to get into the factory more of saying, hey, let's just take me around on your phone in the factory and let's see what's going on, right? So you can use some technology to actually facilitate those things that do go beyond conversations. Hopefully you've seen Office Space and understand what this is, because I don't know what a TPS report is. Do you? But part of this is I remember working with a research team a long time ago, and they kind of went off. They were like, yeah, we're going to do this. They kind of kept telling me, yeah, we're working on that. And they came back and they were like, put the search bar in the upper right. And you're like, well, wait, why? What do you mean? So some of this is like, when you are doing product research, make sure you include your team, right? So don't just write this big long report and send it off to people. And by the way, hi, I'm Todd Lombardo. And once I did some research, I wrote a long report and sent it off to people. And it's a bad idea. Because how many people actually read the long, lengthy report? Very few. In fact, when I was at Constant Contact leading the innovation team, we went off, did a week of design sprint and then a week of like a marketing, sort of framing everything in the market. So we had sort of the qualitative stuff from the design sprint and the quantitative stuff from the market. We put it together to like literally a 53-page report. I don't think maybe 2 people read the whole thing. It was a terrible idea and a waste of time. We spent like 2 weeks putting the report after that. So it was like a month of work that shouldn't have happened. So don't write a report, right? So what you can do is, but everyone clicks through the prototype thing, right? Everyone looks at the Figma or the Adobe, whatever. They look at the prototypes. They want to see what it is. In fact, I just came to this meeting from showing somebody a prototype. And one of the things my colleague Aras had done was he realized that, well, everyone clicks through the links in the prototype. So what if we actually baked in the results of the research into the prototype? So as somebody's clicking through, it's actually telling a story of how we actually got to this and why we made these design choices and what are the different possible solutions. So it was a very clever way to engage his team and share the results of his work through this narrative prototype. So super cool. I didn't know that like narrating or annotating wireframes was a common thing years ago, but this was a really interesting way to narrate a more story, basically add that storytelling into the prototype itself. So it's pretty cool. So rule number 6 is like, don't write a report. Make sure you figure out how to share things in ways that are going to be shareable in your team, in your organization. Reports, big, long reports are rarely the thing. So think about that. Matt LeMay is known well for this like 1 page, 1 hour. And I think that's a great thing. If you can summarize what you've done in a page or 1 or 2 pages, spend no more than an hour on it, that's the kind of thing you want to be shareable. Right? That's the executive summary you need to share the different folks. Get them enticed, get them to ask questions, to be more engaged in what you're doing. All right. So one of the things that I think every product person gets to either is like, should we do research? When do we do research? How do we do it? Even getting buy-in to do it. But we always have to like put on our caps of saying no to things as product folks. And so one of the things, and this is a little bit from, if you've ever read the book, Never Split the Difference, highly recommend it. But ask that question, well, how are we going to do that? Like if somebody executive comes in, it's like, oh, you should do blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, how are we going to do that, right? So some people might come in when you're doing your research or you've done it, like they have the idea, they think they have the answer. And sometimes rather than just saying flat out no, because maybe in your mind, you're like, that's not going to work because we tried it, we have some other data. Just ask the question, how are we going to do that? And I actually did this once where a CEO of a company I was working at goes off to Toronto to a conference, comes back, has a zillion ideas about what we should do with the product. and starts to outline it to me. And so I'm like, I'm like, okay, so how are we going to do that? And how are we going to do that? I just literally just kept nodding and asking how we're going to do that, and just kind of noting and having him delineate how we're going to actually do all these things, and kind of getting into the details, right? You're not trying to like go against him and be like flat out, no, we can't do that, right? Because that's just going to shut him down, or it'll just be the wrong thing. Then what I did is I said, okay, well, if I understand you correctly, you want to, remove this, change this over here, add this kind of billing situation. So I kind of put back more in my own words of what he just said. And I said, does that seem right? And he's like, yes, that's right. And the point behind this is trying to don't make it about you. Don't even make it about them. Make it about this other thing, like the product, right? The ideas. Because then it's not personal. It's not like you against me. It's we're talking about this other thing here. You don't want to say you're right, right? You want to kind of avoid that you're right. Because when somebody says to you, you're right, then they're kind of like admitting that they're wrong. And there also is probably a little subtle antagonism there. Nobody likes to be proven wrong, even though, rule number one, prepare to be wrong. But if you can get to the phrase, that's right, that's really good. And so what I then did was, to continue this story, I just said, okay, so, this is what you've just described, or how we need to do this. And then I started to lay out like, okay, well, these are the things that we agreed to in our strategy meeting 2 weeks ago. And I started to just like, does this mean this is more important? Oh, no. Okay, so does this mean this is more important than that? Oh, no, right? So part of it was also driving him to also then steer the conversation. So, okay, well, this is great. This is all the things you just said that we should do, and this is how we should do it. How does that line up to the stuff we've all already elucidated and agreed on in our strategy meeting? And I basically got him to go with like a whole bunch of no's, right? So sometimes to get to the yes, which yes, I don't want to do those things, you have to go through no, and actually it can get you a better thing. So again, some of these techniques are described way better than I can in a few minutes by Chris in Never Split the Difference. And I highly recommend you as a product person to go read that. It's really important. But ultimately, like, you have to negotiate like an FBI agent. And Chris Voss is an FBI agent, or retired FBI agent. That's what his book was about. But sometimes you have to have that FBI agent like negotiation skills when you're either advocating for your users or advocating for something, or trying to avoid something. Because an FBI agent can't say, oh, you've got $10 million or you want $10 million for those 7 hostages. Well, you just give us 3 hostages, we'll split the difference and we're done. Like, you can't do that, right? You got to get all hostages out and you can't pay them a dime. So you have to have that sort of winner take all kind of thing. All right, getting towards the end here. I think you all know this, right? You think about what we do sometimes actually tells us what our priorities are versus what we say the priorities are. And I think if you've been in product at any time, you know that the problems are the things you want to prioritize and not the solutions. Because if you try to prioritize the solutions themselves and say, okay, well, would that solve the problem? No? Okay, well, then that solution didn't work, right? You still have the problem. And if the problem still was a priority enough, you got to figure out a way to fix it. So when I think we all know this, thinking problems, right? So that value over effort. And if you don't prioritize, you're going to struggle as any product person. The same thing with prioritizing what to research, right? What do you focus on? Where do you put your time? If you have like a handful of those key research questions, those key North Star questions that I mentioned earlier, you might only be able to try to tackle 1 or 2 of them at a time. And this is where your prioritization skills will come into play. Like, if we answer this question, how much further along would be, how much better of a solution might we be able to have, right? How much more value can we add to our customers and our business at the same time? So if you don't prioritize, you're in trouble. And last one is, continuous improvement. I think we all kind of get this, but when it comes to research, the things you want to do is do it over and over, not so that it's like a project, that it's just part of who we are. It's kind of like doing yoga. Don't do it for 3 hours on Sunday afternoon. Do it for 10 minutes a day, right? That's will be much better for you if you do it in smaller increments on a more frequent basis. So, I saw this tweet by Doug Collins, and he was like, yeah, what do you do when there's not enough time to do a research project? And I was like, have you heard of color.com? Because they kind of didn't do any research, right? Little snarky on my end, but And here's an example of a PM in the Boston area, Jeff. He used to work at AppQs. I think he's moved on. I think he might be at HubSpot now. But what he did when he was at AppQs was they actually ran user sessions the last Wednesday of every month. They established a cadence and they stuck to it. They made it visible across the team by setting up anytime somebody signed up for a research session, they would get a Slack posting, and then people could like comment on it, like, "Oh, hey, this customer showed up, cool," or "He's going to show up." And they'd make the research sessions public so that people could observe. They couldn't necessarily participate, but they could watch them, observe them, and see what happened. And then they would follow up at a larger company meeting, like, "Hey, for those who were at this research, here's what the outcome was, and here's what we decided to do because of that," right? So closing the loop as well. It's not just communicating it to the team and getting them involved habitually, but also telling them like, "Well, okay, great. This is what we learned, and this is what we're doing with that knowledge." So be like Jeff, right? Figure out a way to include it into your habits, and think about habit formations, right? Anytime you formed a habit, has there been some element of regularity? Has there been some trigger action and reward? One of the things that, just from a personal perspective, like years ago, my sister was like, "Hey, I wanted to get in better shape." So my sister and I were like, "Well, what if we worked out in the morning together?" And so we got up at 5 a.m., got to the gym at 5:30. We lived in different places at the time, but it was like the fact that I had to get up and meet my sister at 5:30 in the morning, like there's a level of social pressure there. And so that's what Jeff was doing with the Slack channel, is like getting that social pressure there, like anticipation of like, "Oh, okay, I've got to get there," right? For me, there was also a fun little like sibling rivalry there. Like, all right, can I go like work, can I beat my sister in the next workout kind of thing? But those are the kind of things that can help you with those continuing of those habits forming over time, right? You got to build in like those sort of subtle rewards along the way. And so here's a couple examples. Like they would do, maybe they even share their interview script or their prototype, or maybe it was a production app. There's a lot of different things that they would do if they were doing something discovery, something evaluative, something more generative or descriptive. So they would publish this before and after the research session. So again, making this accessible to people as well. So last rule is really about making product research a habit, finding a way to do it small chunks continually rather than just doing it one big project once at a time. I think Teresa Torres, if you don't know of her or haven't read her latest book, Continuous Discovery Habits, you absolutely should. It's full of a lot of wonderful things about how to embed and make discovery continuous in because it's not the team that has the most funding, it's not the team that has the most data, it's the team that's the most adaptable is the ones that are actually going to survive. And to be adaptable, you have to make a habit of being adaptable, right? And research will do that. So let's sum this up. 9 rules, right? Here they are. Prepare to be wrong. Like, you're going to be biased. Start with that key vision question, right? That North Star question, right? You got to make sure you're doing interviews because they're foundational, but sometimes don't just stop there. Go beyond the interview. Never write a report because you need to share your results and share them in a way that's going to be good for your organization. Negotiate like an FBI agent, because there's sometimes where you're going to need to have that level of negotiation. You're going to need a winner-take-all kind of thing. Sometimes you're not. Always prioritize what you need to do, even your research, not just the problems to solve. And then, of course, lastly, make it a habit. So those are the 9 rules. But of course, like any rules, they can sometimes be broken, right? Actually, sorry, these are all in Spanish. I forgot to switch my, maybe I did actually have them in English. Cool, because sometimes you're right. Maybe you should limit yourself because there's sometimes to focus, right? Sometimes you just need to build something, just get it built and get it out there. Sometimes you should follow your ideas and not what the research says. Sometimes you want to go fast and not far. Sometimes you should write a report. It's pretty rare though. Sometimes you just need to agree and not negotiate. Sometimes you do need to try to do it all. And sometimes you just need to keep the status quo to keep things going, right? There's always exceptions to every rule. And I'm sure we all have stories that could fit into any of these 9 boxes. So those are the 9 rules, but I do have one secret rule, and that is to always, always, always talk about product. Because when we talk to each other, we share ideas. When we share ideas, we get better at things. And when we get better at things, we stop making products that people don't want. We start making good products that people actually need. So with that, I want to say thank you all for listening. Thank you, David, for inviting me today. And maybe we have a couple time for a handful of questions.
Yeah, so thanks so much again, C Todd. That was excellent. I really like that bonus tip as well around always talking about product, because really that's what we're here to do today and with all our meetups as well. So thank you very much for that. So guys, if you do have any questions, we have time for a couple of questions, and please add them to the Q&A panel. So I'll just read out the first one from Jaron. So how are we going to do that? I feel I need to push my stakeholders and customers more towards a why. Do you feel you're focusing on a solution rather than a problem with this question? Is that bad?
Sometimes, but what it forces somebody to do is think through a solution, and then you can start to understand, like, okay, how are we going to do that? How are we gonna, okay, interesting. How's your life better when that happens, right? And you start to allude back, so bring the conversation around from a solution conversation to more a problem conversation. Like, okay, so you've told me how you're going to do that. Well, let me back up and just think, what problems it solve for you? Like, what's that outcome look like for you when that's done? So you can start to find techniques to go away from just solution and back towards framing it as a problem. But it's good to understand sometimes that it can paint a context, right? Let them talk about their ideas in that solution and why we should do it before you maybe bring it back.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. So Medav just asking, are the slides or recording available, C Todd?
Yeah, sure. We can definitely make and so isn't some of this going to be on Skills Matter too?
Yeah, exactly. So we are actually recording. So guys, the platform we're on, Skills Matter, who are hosting us today. The recordings will be available there. So you just need to log in and you can find the recording. Excellent. Sita, just a quick question for myself, if that's okay. Just one thing I was curious about.
Yeah.
I really like the quote you had about kind of learning more about someone in an hour of play than a day of conversation. I think, Steve Blank talks about getting out of the building. And obviously, it's been hard to get out of the building for the last 18 months.
Yes.
Do you have any tips for researching remotely?
Yeah, and sometimes actually when we actually put a bit of a pause on publishing this book because we were almost done before the pandemic hit. And once it did, it was really highlighted the need for us to wait. We really need to think more and incorporate more stories and more context and rethink some of the chapters because it was, oh, wow, the world is changing and we need to make sure we account for more remote type of things. So I think I told you the story of when I was at Machine Metrics, we started to use these a lot. So we actually have either you doing FaceTime or having the team add Zoom to their mobile app and go on the factory floor. There's also some interesting things that happened. One person we spoke with, actually, they said that if they were in the room, they were interviewing a couple about mortgages. They said if they were in the room, they would have never gotten the insight around how this couple was thinking about their mortgage. They were buying a second home, and it was like who was going to be on that mortgage for the second home. And I think the one of the partners was like, well, it should just be in my name, not our name. And the other one was like, what do you mean just your name? What are you going to do with it? Like, it was this really interesting, it opened this very interesting conversation that you can imagine that a married couple, if you're in the room with them, they might get into kind of an argument if you're actually in the room, but they might probably tamp it down like, oh, let's be polite. We've got somebody here. But the fact that somebody was remote and they ended up and they were in their house, they were in a comfortable environment. So they just opened up. And there was all this like antagonism that came out, and it was like, whoa. And this ended up being a pattern because they observed this of similar types of things at different with different married couples. And it was like certain married couples that maybe had a little bit of a strain in their relationship and had certain kinds of financial arrangements. And it was like, So but the first one was like, that was interesting. And they saw the second one like, okay, there's a pattern here. How do we understand this a little bit more? Right. So sometimes it actually is good to do a mix, right? Of in-person and not in-person. I was just telling David before we got on stage here that like, I'm actually in an office for the first time in about a year and a half, meeting some colleagues I've never met before. And it's wonderful. But also the same way, it's really hard. Sometimes you're like, I had so many other things that I could do, and I'm actually a lot less productive right now because I'm meeting all these people face to face. So it is the blend. And I think that's the one thing to think about is, how do you blend it in the right way? Because if you are remote, you can actually get access to a broader market or a broader user set. Because I mean, you're in Ireland right now. I'm in Boston. There's an ocean between us. And so there's some advantages to that. But also, if you can get this involved in some way, like get people to show you more of their life than just like a laptop recording, that's when you can start to get some pretty interesting things that go beyond a conversation.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting because sometimes there's an assumption that remote is bad or worse, but it has its own strengths as well. So, that was super interesting. See, Todd, we'll let you go. First of all, thanks so much again for your talk. Really enjoyed it. Very insightful.
Pleasure.
I loved the 9 rules. Lots of knowledge bombs in there, so need to rewatch it again. Where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, sure. Best thing is follow me on Twitter. I am Todd. That's probably the best thing. My website's relatively static, but it does have jump points to other things, including Twitter. But that's probably the place I'm most active, or LinkedIn. I'll tend to post stuff there, but I'm most active on Twitter in terms of what I'm up to. I usually speak or teach at Mind the Product conferences as well, and occasionally here and there. But reach out to me on Twitter if you want to learn more, or just give me a follow.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks again. And hopefully we'll see you again in person in Dublin at some stage.
That would be awesome. Oh, I'd love it. I'd love it. I'd love it.
Excellent.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks again, David.
Thanks
Have a
again.
good night, everybody.